It was just after sunrise when Air India Flight 171 lifted off the runway, an ordinary departure that became an extraordinary disaster within mere seconds. The aircraft, a modern Boeing 787 Dreamliner, had just achieved rotation when it suddenly lost thrust and fell from the sky. It struck buildings just beyond the airfield perimeter, claiming lives and sending shockwaves through the aviation community and the world. At first, theories ranged from bird strikes to catastrophic mechanical failure, even sabotage. But now, less than a month later, we have the first official clue, a preliminary report that offers an explanation few could have predicted. It wasn't the engines. It wasn't the fuel. It was two switches. Two switches that, when moved, do exactly one thing: kill the engines. And they were moved. Intentionally or not, both switches controlling fuel flow to the engines were found in the cutoff position. And with that, Air India 171 had no chance to remain airborne. In the next 14 minutes, we'll walk you through what we know, what likely happened in the cockpit, and why the answer may lie in an often ignored dimension of flight safety, mental health. If this kind of in-depth aviation investigation matters to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're here to dig deep, not sensationalize. Now let's talk about the facts. The report from India's Air Investigation Bureau, handed confidentially to key government stakeholders and obtained by major outlets like Reuters, The Wall Street Journal, and AirCurrent, suggests a startling cause for the dual-engine failure: manual fuel cutoff. The switches controlling fuel flow to the jet's two General Electric engines were moved to the cutoff position shortly after takeoff, shutting down both engines. These are not switches you brush against accidentally. They're spring-loaded, shielded with detents to prevent unintended activation. Moving one requires a conscious, coordinated motion: pull up, over, and down. To move both requires deliberate, successive actions. Investigators believe this is precisely what happened. Within moments of liftoff, both engines were starved of fuel. The only plausible mechanical scenario that triggers this is a human-initiated shutdown. Now, here's where the findings deepen in significance. On a Boeing 787, the loss of both engines also results in a loss of primary power systems, electrical and hydraulic. The RAT, or ram air turbine, automatically deploys in such cases. In this incident, the RAT deployed almost instantly, confirming that both engines had indeed lost power very early, perhaps within 4 to 6 seconds of takeoff. That's not speculation, that's system-confirmed data. It shifts this crash from a mystery to a focused investigation into cockpit actions, and that brings us to a critical crossroads in understanding what happened. To grasp the magnitude of this situation, you need to understand how fuel control switches work in a modern jetliner. These are not simple on-off toggles. On the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, the fuel control switches, also known as engine run switches, require both intent and effort to operate. They are deliberately built with mechanical resistance to prevent accidental use. The switch must be pulled up and back to move from run to cutoff, which cuts fuel to the engine and initiates a shutdown. These switches are normally only used during engine startup and shutdown, typically on the ground. In normal procedures, pilots use them at the end of every flight, once they've reached the gate and parked. For both switches to be placed in the cutoff position during a climb-out phase, immediately after takeoff, is unheard of. There's no known training procedure, checklist, or system failure that would call for such an action in those first critical seconds of flight. The only checklist involving both switches in the air is for a dual engine failure, and even that involves toggling them off and back on again, not leaving them in the cutoff position. That is what has stunned the aviation world. Experts aren't merely raising their eyebrows, they're raising red flags. Because if there's no mechanical reason to do this, then what was the reason? Let's reconstruct the tragic 60 seconds that made up the entire flight of Air India 171. Seconds after liftoff, the aircraft began a normal climb. The engines were producing full thrust, but just 6 to 8 seconds in, the aircraft's systems registered a loss of engine power, both engines. That's when the RAT deployed. The RAT is a last resort device used to generate emergency power through air movement. Its rapid deployment is a smoking gun. It means that both engines were already offline, not failing gradually, but instantaneously. Eyewitnesses and radar data confirm the jet began to lose altitude almost immediately. It wallowed in the air, unable to maintain lift. Less than a minute after takeoff, the aircraft collided with structures beyond the airport boundary. The force of the impact and the subsequent fire left little survivability for those on board. But the timeline tells us this wasn't a long, drawn-out mechanical failure. It wasn't a bird strike or fuel contamination event. It was sudden, precise, final, and the cockpit voice recorder may hold the key to whether it was confusion, malfunction, or something more human. With accidental movement ruled out due to the design of the switches, investigators are left with just 3 possibilities. First, a critical pilot error, perhaps in response to a misinterpreted engine issue. But that doesn't align with the airline's simulator tests. Air India pilots reenacted dozens of failure scenarios: single engine loss, flap configuration issues, hydraulic problems. In none of these did they instinctively or mistakenly touch both fuel switches. The second theory? Sabotage, internal or external. But initial background checks and cockpit access logs show no indication of foul play or unauthorized access. That leaves the most troubling possibility: an intentional act by one of the pilots. This is not a conclusion any investigator wants to reach. It carries enormous implications for passenger trust and airline safety. Yet the data is forcing the conversation in that direction. It may be too early to assign motive, but the physical evidence, switch position, RAT deployment, absence of other failures, all points to human agency. And that demands we ask harder questions, not just of procedures and checklists, but of the psychological wellness of those in command. The aviation industry has long emphasized technical proficiency, but it is only in recent years that mental health has begun receiving serious attention. The tragic possibility that a deliberate cockpit action led to the shutdown of both engines on Air India 171 demands we look deeper, not just into the systems and checklists, but into the human mind behind the controls. Airline pilots face immense pressures: grueling schedules, time zone changes, prolonged separations from family, sleep deprivation, and constant responsibility for hundreds of lives. These are not abstract stressors, they're real, cumulative, and in some cases, debilitating. And yet, pilots are expected to perform flawlessly, day after day. They are trained to handle emergencies, mechanical failures, and bad weather, but not always the emotional storms within. Despite growing awareness, mental health remains a taboo in aviation. Admitting to depression or anxiety can, in many cases, jeopardize a pilot's career. So many suffer in silence. They pass medicals. They perform well until something breaks. If the preliminary findings in the Air India 171 crash are confirmed, they may serve as yet another wake-up call, similar to the Germanwings Flight 9525 tragedy in 2015, forcing us to ask, are we doing enough to care for the people we trust with our skies? Commercial aviation is built on a foundation of Standard Operating Procedures, or SOPs. These meticulously documented checklists and flows are designed to eliminate ambiguity, reduce workload under pressure, and above all, prevent human error. In a Boeing 787, everything from engine start to emergency descent is covered by SOPs and reinforced through simulator training. And in cases of engine failure, the response is always structured. You lose an engine on takeoff, you fly the airplane, you climb to a safe altitude. At 400 feet or more, you assess, then begin troubleshooting. It's deliberate, methodical, and verified through challenge and response between the two pilots. No one acts alone. No one is supposed to flip switches without confirmation, and never, under any SOP, is both fuel control levers placed to cut off simultaneously unless performing a specific dual engine failure checklist, which involves placing them to cut off only to reset them back to run. It's a temporary reset, not a termination. The procedure is fast, clear, and practiced often. The fact that Air India 171 had both switches left in cutoff with no attempt to restart is deeply troubling. It suggests a deviation so extreme that SOPs weren't simply forgotten. They may have been bypassed entirely. One of the most telling pieces of evidence in this case is the RAM air turbine, or RAT, deployment. This backup device is not something passengers ever hear about, nor should they. It only activates under extreme conditions: total electrical failure, total hydraulic failure, or dual engine flameout. On the Boeing 787, the RAT deploys automatically when both engines lose thrust in flight. What makes this case extraordinary is the speed at which the RAT deployed, just seconds after takeoff. This tells us two critical things. First, the engines didn't slowly fail. They were shut off instantly and simultaneously. Second, the aircraft had already transitioned from ground logic to airborne logic. That's determined by sensors in the landing gear. Once the wheels leave the ground, the aircraft knows it's flying. And in airborne mode, the instant both engines quit, the RAT deploys. On the ground, it wouldn't. So this wasn't a ground error, it wasn't a pre-flight maintenance failure. The shutdown occurred in the air, under flight logic, and the RAT response confirms it. This technical fact eliminates a dozen possible causes and narrows focus precisely to those fuel switches and the hands that moved them. Captain Steve, an airline captain and trained counselor who's flown the Boeing 787, shared insights that lend further gravity to the report. He described the process of using fuel switches on every flight, how they are used only on the ground, at shutdown. He emphasized how much effort it takes to move them, how unlikely it is that one could be flipped accidentally, let alone both. Pilots train extensively for engine-out scenarios. They're taught to maintain control, climb, and only start troubleshooting once they're stable, typically above 1,000 feet. And in simulators, scenarios involving engine loss during takeoff are drilled repeatedly. What's consistent across all training? You don't touch those fuel switches unless you have consensus and checklist guidance. Captain Steve's concern, echoed by many professionals, is that this was not a training issue nor a systems issue. It appears to be a human decision, either one made under severe emotional stress or for reasons we may never fully understand. For experienced pilots, that realization hits hard. It's a violation not just of procedure, but of trust. Trust between crew, passengers, and the entire aviation system. It's not just what happened, it's what shouldn't have. For many, the news about Air India 171 stirred haunting echoes of the Germanwings 9525 crash in 2015. In that tragedy, a co-pilot suffering from untreated depression locked the captain out of the cockpit and deliberately crashed the plane into the French Alps, killing all 150 on board. It stunned the world and changed the industry. After Germanwings, many airlines introduced mandatory psychological screenings and required that 2 crew members be in the cockpit at all times. And yet, mental health in aviation remains a fragile subject. Fear of losing medical certification discourages many pilots from seeking help. Peer support programs exist, but their reach varies by country, airline, and culture. What the Germanwings case revealed, and what the Air India 171 crash may be reinforcing, is the need for emotional wellness to be treated with the same rigor as mechanical safety. Planes are designed with backups for everything. Engines fail, computers reboot. But what is the backup for a struggling mind? We need more than checklists. We need connection, openness, and systems that protect pilots without punishing them for seeking help. Captain Steve, who is both a commercial airline pilot and a trained counselor with over 30 years of experience, shared a personal story that changed how he approached flying forever. Years ago, while serving as a flight instructor in the U.S. Navy, he encountered a trainee, an exceptional student, who on the morning of an evaluation flight appeared off. Not physically unwell, but emotionally distant. Midway through the flight, the student's performance collapsed. Steve, puzzled and concerned, asked one simple question: "Are you okay?" What followed was an emotional breakdown. The student confessed he had spent the night on the phone with his father, talking him down from suicide. 3 hours later, he was expected to fly an advanced training mission. Steve stopped the flight, took control, and recommended the student take a week off. That decision likely saved more than one life. The student eventually returned, earned his wings, and his father got help. From that day on, Captain Steve added one vital step to every pre-flight brief: a genuine check-in. How are you really doing? Not a surface-level nod, but a heartfelt inquiry. It's a simple gesture, but in the high-stakes world of aviation, it could be life-saving. The story is not just touching, it's instructive. It suggests a cultural shift, a need to build psychological awareness into cockpit procedures, because not every emergency comes with a warning light. Some start in silence. One of the most difficult conversations in aviation is the distinction between human error and the human condition. Human error implies failure in judgment, deviation from procedure, or a mistake that training can fix. The human condition, however, is deeper. It's the emotional weight people carry, the stress, depression, grief, or anxiety that even the best training can't always mitigate. If the preliminary findings from the Air India 171 crash are true, that someone in the cockpit manually shut down both engines shortly after takeoff, it's no longer about error. It's about condition. This possibility doesn't excuse what happened, but it reframes the conversation. It asks us to consider what warning signs may have been missed, not in checklists, but in behavior. Was the pilot distracted during the briefing? Were there changes in personality? Was fatigue or personal stress impacting their readiness to fly? And most importantly, what systems, if any, were in place to catch these red flags before they reached the flight deck? Aviation safety has evolved to make aircraft more resilient to mechanical failure. Now we must evolve emotionally, making our systems more resilient to internal collapse, of mind, not metal. Crew Resource Management, or CRM, is one of aviation's most important safety protocols. It emphasizes communication, mutual oversight, and coordinated decision-making among the flight crew. CRM is designed to prevent solo errors by creating an environment where both pilots work as a team, challenging and confirming each other's actions. But CRM is only as strong as the trust and emotional health of the individuals practicing it. If one pilot is distracted, distressed, or mentally unwell, that entire system becomes compromised. In the case of Air India 171, if one pilot had a personal crisis and the other was unaware, or perhaps even absent from active monitoring, CRM may have failed. And when CRM fails, safety fails. This incident reminds us that effective cockpit collaboration isn't just about procedure, it's about people. It's about asking questions like, "How's your family?" or "Are you getting enough sleep?" before asking, "Are the flaps set for departure?" Airlines invest in CRM training to prevent miscommunication. Maybe it's time we expand CRM to include psychological wellness checks, both formal and informal. Because no checklist can cover what we don't talk about. So what happens now? If investigators confirm that both fuel switches were manually set to cutoff without cause, it will likely lead to major industry shifts. First, expect mandatory cockpit voice recorder reviews in all similar incidents, especially when RAT deployment occurs. Second, psychological evaluations may be strengthened across major airlines, possibly with anonymous reporting or peer-based mental wellness programs. Some carriers already have confidential support systems where pilots can self-report stress or depression without risking career ruin. That model may soon become global. Simulator training may also evolve, not just to practice technical emergencies, but to rehearse recognizing and responding to signs of emotional distress in a fellow pilot. Regulators could introduce new cockpit protocols requiring both pilots to verbally confirm not just readiness, but emotional stability. All of this will be difficult to implement. Culture change always is. But if we learn from Air India 171, we may prevent the next tragedy not by building stronger engines, but by building stronger humans. In the end, the crash of Air India 171 may be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a tipping point, a moment when aviation confronted not its systems, but its soul. We may never fully understand what led to those switches being flipped. Maybe the cockpit voice recorder will give us clarity, maybe it won't. But one thing is now certain: the airplane didn't fail. The engines didn't fail. The systems didn't fail. A person made a decision. Whether that decision came from confusion, despair, or a deliberate act, the result was the same. Lives lost, trust shaken. But from this, we can choose a path forward. One where we ask better questions, listen more closely, and value emotional health with the same urgency as mechanical integrity. Captain Steve said it best. When you've eliminated all that is impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. This truth is hard, but it's ours now. So let's honor those lost not with blame, but with better systems, deeper compassion, and vigilance toward the mines flying our skies. If you found this story informative, please share it. Awareness is our first step toward change. Stay safe and look out for one another. We'll see you next time.